Welcome to the Liberty and Leadership Podcast, a conversation with TFAS alumni, faculty, and friends who are making an impact today. I'm your host, Roger Reen. My guest today on the Liberty and Leadership Podcast is Dr. Mark Skousen, a writer and economist and the Doti-Spogli Chair of Free Enterprise at Chapman University in Southern California. He's a lecturer on business, economics, and finance, former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, an organization I have a long history with as well, and is a frequent speaker and writer on many topics around the country. He writes and speaks for the Cato Institute, the Foundation for Economic Education, the Libertarian Party, the Council on National Policy, and the Mont Pelerin Society. He's the editor of markskousen.com and the founder of FreedomFest, one of the largest pro-liberty, nonpartisan conventions held each year in our country. His latest book is The Greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, the World's Most Versatile Genius, which was published earlier this year, something I highly recommend and you can find wherever fine books are sold. Mark, thank you for joining me on the Liberty and Leadership Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, another book, I don't know what number this is. It's probably, you've written at least a dozen over the years, and a lot of really good books on economics, another Franklin book earlier, which we'll touch on, but you've had a very diverse career as well in government, academia, business, writing and publishing. What inspires you to write books in general?
I always want to write a book that nobody else has really written about. If somebody has come up with a book that I just put my name on it and it's virtually the same, I wouldn't be interested in that. So I wrote my economics textbook, Economic Logic, because I didn't like the way other textbooks were written. I don't think for example, no economics textbook has a profit and loss statement, a P&L statement, which is all accountants and finance. That's their main focus. No economics textbook has on. Then I think it's because most economists are academic and they don't have any real world experience with hiring and firing people and making payroll and all that sort of thing. So I've added that to the Economic Logic textbook that I wrote. The Making of Modern Economics is a history of the great economic thinkers. And there's no plot to all the others. There's just this school, this economist. It's a hodgepodge. And I tried to make it into an actual story with a hero who has heroes and enemies and has a good ending and so forth. So that's my Making of Modern Economics. Completed Franklin's autobiography. Nobody had ever done that before. So I try to do things making a real contribution in my writing.
Well, and you've done that with these books, and you've touched on some of them. There's a pile right here on the set, and I've got some off the set here because they said if I put them all here, we wouldn't be able to see us. So that brings me to maybe a question I was going to ask you, which now becomes a challenging question, perhaps, is a biography of Benjamin Franklin. Surely people have written those. So what inspired you to write about Ben Franklin, and what's unique about your book?
Okay, so it's not a biography. There's a 2-page biography to just give a little summary of his life, and then there's 80 short chapters on how to apply Franklin's life and his work to today's hot issues and topics that would be of interest, of politics, of economics, personal finance, healthy living, religion. There's a variety of topics, diplomacy and so forth. So you can read it in any part. You can read any chapter, a standalone chapter, because it was originally a series of columns that I wrote for Newsmax's magazine called Franklin Prosperity Report. Came out every month. And so I wrote these columns, and then I've edited them, and I've added some new chapters as well, and it created this book, The Greatest American. But I will tell you that Newsmax did reject one of my columns.
Is that right?
Yeah, they censored one of the columns. So what do you think the topic was?
It's in the book?
Yeah,
now?
Yeah, I put it in the book.
Is this about Jefferson and sex?
It is on sex, and it's Franklin.
I mean,
and
Franklin.
sex.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Franklin.
Yeah, exactly. You could do one on Jefferson.
I saw that in there.
Sex as well.
That's
for sure.
true.
But so it's in the book, and I had a lot of fun putting this together, but it took 6 or 7 years to put it together, and it's all applying Franklin to today's issues of the trade war, inflation, taxation,
foreign policy,
personal finance, all of these kinds of things. There's a lot of great one-liners by Franklin. He was really the original one-liner stand-up comedian in a lot of ways.
You have a personal connection to him, right? Could you explain that?
This is probably why I've completed Franklin's autobiography with my wife's help, and she was instrumental in putting, as an English professor, of working to me with that. And then this one is this series of columns called The Greatest American. So I'm probably a little prejudiced with the title.
You have some data in there, some quotes from historians and others who put them right up there.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who really would be regarded as the greatest Americans, but Franklin is one who, as the subtitle says, the world's most versatile genius. I came up to 22 careers that he had. So he's a jack of all trades and a master of many. Getting back to my tradition that my family was related to Benjamin Franklin through my mother's line. And John and I went back and did the genealogy and found the missing link, if you will, because we didn't know exactly how we were related. And it turned out to be through an illegitimate line, just like a traditional Franklin perspective.
Well, I think my mother once found my line related to Benedict Arnold, of all people.
Oh, my God.
Fortunately, she found an illegitimate line, so I'm actually not.
Well, if it was illegitimate, it's still the line. It's still DNA.
Yeah, but I think it was an adoption.
Oh, okay.
Adoption, yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the 80 practical lessons in your book, and you may have some favorites that are particularly relevant to people today, but I saw one was that Franklin, his defense of the rich. Most people may know his belief in hard work, but what's his defense of the rich, would you say?
So he described how the poor laws that were passed by England were passed by wealthy people who wanted to help out people who were poor and needed a chance to educate and so forth. So he was a firm believer in the capitalist system. And he's really, in many ways, the father of American capitalism, because how do you encourage people? How do you give them incentives to perform well? And wealth is a way to do that. And then he felt very strongly that money that you made in business should be used for good purposes. And so he would qualify the defense of wealthy people by suggesting you need to do good with your wealth and not just splurge on a big mansion and being on a cruise ship around the world and so on. You need to be involved in good charitable works. And he made this point about religion as well. So he said at the end of his life, the years go by and the longer I live, I'm hopeful that at the end, I will be known as the person who used my money well rather than I simply died rich. So usefulness was very much, and he started the junto. There's lots of things he did to encourage industry and thrift, but you have to be able to keep that money. You can't just, if it's progressively taxed away, then what's the incentive to become wealthy? But he did feel the wealthy had a responsibility to use their wealth prudently.
Yeah, and I know you wrote in there about his emphasis on economy and not just being spendthrift, or that millionaires can go broke.
Yeah, they can.
And there's a story in there you tell about him leaving a bequest for the cities of Philadelphia and Boston of, I think, 1,000 pounds each, and how he directed them to use it so it would grow. And do you recall that story?
I have a chapter on the case for compounded interest.
Yeah.
And he heard this story about compounded interest, and he said, well, I think at the end of my life, I'm going to test and see if this skill, because he's not going to be able to live for 200 years. So he gave 1,000 pounds to each of the cities. This is in his last will and testament. And he said the first 100 years, you simply invested in bank accounts and you just you compound interest. And however much that is after 100 years, you will give out to loans to artisans and to people of practical skills, but they're loans and they have to be paid back on interest. And so he did this, and finally they dissolved both of these accounts after 200 years, as what he said in his last will. And I think Boston had more. I mean, they ended up with $13 million together between the two of them. I think Boston did a better job of investing than Philadelphia. But the result demonstrated very clearly that you could do quite well with power of compounded interest, and you could do good as well because you're loaning the money out to small businesses.
You have a chapter each on Franklin's relationship with John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. Franklin was at both the Constitutional Convention and the Continental
Congress and the Declaration,
where the Declaration was drafted.
Yeah.
What was Franklin's relationship with those other founders?
Well, first of all, with George Washington, he was a very big fan, and he said he single-handedly took on the British, and he was able to succeed. So he was very positive about George Washington and his ability as a general, even though he lost a lot of wars and stuff like that. So he's been criticized over the years, but Franklin was a big supporter of George Washington. In the case of Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson took his place as ambassador to France. He got along with Jefferson a lot, but he disagreed with Jefferson on two areas. One is Jefferson was very critical of paper money. He believed in gold and silver only. Franklin was an inflationist. He actually wrote a pamphlet in favor of printing up money because the British denied gold and silver and wouldn't allow them to mint their own gold and silver. They had to use British money. So Franklin put out a pamphlet advocating the printing of money and got the contract by the Pennsylvania legislature. So he was the first crony capitalist as well. But later in life, he recognized that inflation was not necessarily good. But he was in favor of commercial banks. He loved commercial society. Jefferson thought farming was the best industry that you could have as an occupation. Franklin was a city man. He loved the big cities. He loved London. He loved Paris. He thought Philadelphia was a small town, and even though it was the biggest town in the colonial time periods. So there were these two areas where Franklin was defending commercial society, defending the banking industry. He would probably support Hamilton's central bank. So he's a pretty modern person in that respect.
And what about with Adams? They had a less favorable...
Yes, they got along in the Declaration of Independence part of that. Then they had severe differences when they got over to France because Franklin was 70 years old when he was sent over to be the ambassador. They sent over 4 or 5 other commissioners because they didn't trust Franklin because he was too old and they thought he would be too favorable toward the French. John Adams, he hated the French. He didn't get along well at all. He couldn't raise a single livre in funding. He finally raised some money with the Dutch. So they argued a lot. Adams thought he didn't take the spies seriously, that he was disorganized, that he was a heretic, that he was a non-believer, that he was a womanizer. You go through the whole list, and they did not get along well at all. And in fact, at one point, John Adams wrote a letter, I think it was to Thomas Jefferson, saying, the history of America will be told that Franklin took his electric rod and struck the ground and out popped George Washington, and together they completely won the American Revolution without the help of anyone else. And so he was really very envious of Ben Franklin's success.
Yeah, and Franklin was quite a celebrity in Paris, right?
Well, yeah, I think there's an envious factor, and especially with the women. Franklin got along really well with the French society. He'd go to these salons, which were intellectual get-togethers, and they're run by women. So Franklin's very modern in that respect. He didn't see women as simply sexual objects, but he enjoyed the intelligence and the wonderful discussions that you would have with women, including Madame Brionne, who was a married woman, and Madame Helvétius, who was not. And he actually proposed marriage to Helvétius after his own wife had passed away, and that didn't develop. But it was really a wonderful situation. And John Adams, as well as Abigail, they were together as ambassadors, as commissioners. And they were appalled by the behavior of the women, putting their kissing Franklin and putting their arms around him, and all of the salacious behavior.
With the Puritan Massachusetts background.
They were definitely puritanical.
Yeah. On Saturday, before the day we're recording this, the Postal Service celebrated its 250th anniversary. I'm wearing a pin for a stamp they've put out in honor of that anniversary. It's a reissue of a 4-cent stamp that once was put out earlier with Ben Franklin on it. But he was the first postmaster. Tell me a little more about that role.
Yeah, he was assistant general manager, and then he was made the first full-scale postmaster general when they declared their independence. And he put his son-in-law, Richard Bache, in charge at one point in Philadelphia. But he was overall, when he was back in town, he really developed the post office. And I actually have a whole chapter in The Greatest American on him and his abilities to turn a profit. I think there's some lessons there with the post office and his efficiency. You know, it took 2 weeks to send a letter from Boston all the way to Philadelphia. He got it down to 3 days. So
they can't really do it now in 3 days.
And that increased dramatically the volume of mail and so forth. And he created the dead letter office to try to deal with letters that were not sent properly. And he'd put it in one particular office so they could check on it and stuff like that. He did a lot of things that were really impressive with the postal system. And the postal roads between Boston and New York, for example, you can still take those roads, and they're cleared and they're available.
Still called the Post Road, I think.
Yeah, the Post Road. Areas. Exactly.
Yeah. It went past the Foundation for Economic Education's headquarters in Irvington, New York.
We were on that trail quite frequently.
Yeah.
And I should mention that Franklin has been honored equal to, and perhaps a little better than George Washington now in the number of stamps that have been issued with Franklin's image on there. And I was hopeful, I have always had my idea that we issue a 1 penny stamp that says, with Franklin's image, it says, "A penny saved is a penny earned." Wouldn't that be a nice permanent stamp?
Yeah. The rumors are they're going to discontinue the penny.
Yeah, that will hurt.
In a decade, kids won't know what a penny is.
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, there is a half-cent Franklin stamp. Did you know that? Issued during World War II.
Oh.
Yeah.
I recall that in 2020, I think it was, you interviewed Benjamin Franklin.
That's the final chapter where I've actually performed as Benjamin Franklin a number of times, and it's been a treat. And I'll tell you one thing I've learned, because I've seen a lot of impersonators of Benjamin Franklin. They never have the humor and the satire that Franklin had. Like he said, 3 people can keep a secret if 2 are dead, stuff like that. That's really quite funny. And I have performed there. And so I was interviewed maybe 10 years ago by somebody and I pretended that I was Franklin and getting the answers. And are you an optimist, a pessimist about America? And of course, he was always very optimistic, and he firmly believed in the American dream, and would still, if he were alive today, would be deeply impressed with the higher standard of living and the technology. He'd be the first one to have a cell phone and AI and texting and all that sort of thing. But he would be appalled by the monstrous national debt, which he felt should be paid off, and the welfare state. He was not a particularly fan of the welfare state and things like that. So he'd probably be pretty conservative in that respect. Although I found Republicans and Democrats all love Franklin.
Let me shift gears a little bit. Say something about FreedomFest. I mean, you've turned that into this major conference every year, drawing us people from around the world.
Yeah. I'll start with a quote from Ben Franklin, who said, "It's incredible the quantity of good that a single man can do if he makes a business out of it." And FreedomFest is actually a for-profit event. And so we focus on our customers, our attendees, and our a lot of nonprofits, it's the donors that really make the difference. But for us, the focus is on the attendees. We want to make sure they're happy. And so we have 2,000 to 3,000 people who come every year. The idea of Freedom Fest got started when I was president of FEE. And I thought, well, what can we do to jumpstart the freedom movement, which seems like freedom is on the defense. It's always struggling, and socialism is advancing. I think it's Thomas Jefferson that said liberty is always receding and government's always expanding. So my ideas were like rabbits who are going in all kinds of different directions. And could we all come together, take some time off for 3 or 4 days to learn from each other, to network and socialize and celebrate liberty? And so that's been the idea. We've been doing it for 14 or 15 years, started in 2007. And it's really been a big success. And we try to bring in all the freedom organizations. And the exhibit is John Mackey of Whole Foods calls it the Trade Show for Liberty. Steve Forbes is a very big fan, and he comes every year. Topics. It's a Renaissance gathering of philosophy, history, science and technology, healthy living, politics, economics, finance. We have a 3-day investment conference. We have the Anthem Film Festival that my wife goes on. You can't believe the hundreds of people who want to see the latest films, documentaries, narratives, and stuff like that, shorts, long features. We have a comedy show. We have a libertarian magician. I have my white mates in two chess problem in the exhibit hall. There's something for everybody to do, and nobody's ever bored at Freedom Fest. So it's once a year. We're doing it next year in Las Vegas at the Caesars Forum Convention Center, right across from Caesars Palace. It's July 8th through the 11th, and we're hoping to have another big crowd and some celebrity speakers. Kennedy is always our MC now for the last 3 or 4 years from Fox News. It's really a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to see the Fund for American Studies out there, and Roger.
We've been there
Roger
at
Reed.
times. Yeah.
Maybe do a show there.
Yeah. Harkening back to something about Franklin and Jefferson, you just mentioned Jefferson's comment that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground.
That's what it is. Great quote.
Which is kind of a form of pessimism. And many of the framers were pessimistic about how long this experiment in liberty would last. There's a story told about Franklin at the very end of the Continental Congress, I think it was, that he said to the delegates, I've been looking at the back of General Washington's chair throughout the convention, and there's a sunburst painted on it.
Yeah.
And I've wondered whether it's a rising sun or a setting sun. And throughout much of the convention, I thought it must be a setting sun. But now that we've reached agreement on this document, I realize it's a rising sun. And he seemed optimistic about the future. And you said he was an optimist.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the story told. And what's interesting is, this is the American Eagle silver dollar that I'm holding here, and I use it quite frequently and give it out as gifts and to my students who take my course and stuff. And on the front is quite a few symbols. There's Lady Liberty, which Franklin would really like. It says, "In God we trust." He was a believer, although he was not a churchgoer. And it has the rising sun on there.
What are your thoughts about where we're headed in the economy? I go out to visit a lot of our donors, a lot of people when I travel around the country, and I run into people like I did last week. I'm just so bullish on, I think we're booming because Trump's bringing all this business to America. Companies are building plants here. And then there are others really gloomy about, we're going to go into a deep recession, and because of trade policy or other factors, the spending is out of control. Of course, government is reaching a point where it just can't even fund its basic services because of interest on the debt, the various Social Security, Medicare programs. How are you thinking of things will be like, at least in the short run?
I have a chapter in The Greatest American on Franklin and pessimism, because he was an optimist, and he actually refers to those who are doom and gloomers as croakers, that they're always croaking and complaining and stuff like that. And he tells the story in the autobiography of doom and gloomer croaker that came along and told Ben Franklin, listen, you need to sell all your property because the dearth of business, a depression is coming, and you need to sell. And he said, I was really happy to see that 10 years later, he had to pay considerably more when he finally decided to buy real estate. Franklin was very suspicious and questioned people who were overly pessimistic. It's not to say there weren't troubles. I mean, Franklin himself went through 2 world wars. He went through depressions, crisis, a banking crisis, runaway inflation in America, and yet he was still able to survive and prosper. Why? Because he had a diversified portfolio of rental properties. He had 3 bank accounts. He had a beautiful gift that he got from Louis the 16th, like 100 diamonds or something. And there's some really cool collectibles.
Successful printer too, right?
not hurt by all of these events and stuff. And he seemed to feel optimistic quite frequently. He said there was a really bad winter in France one time, but then the sun came out and the flowers started blooming, and I was happy. And I think even though our country has a lot of problems, we should never sell America short, because we seem to have that ability to make a comeback all the time and so forth. Is that a bust of Franklin back there?
Yes, it is.
Oh my gosh, is that the Houdon bust?
I believe it is.
It could be. And I should tell you, Houdon did busts of Franklin and Jefferson and Washington as well. And the Houdon bust is in the White House. And a month or so ago, Donald Trump had a press conference, and he brought in the Houdon bust of Franklin and had it there in presence. I think he was trying to channel Franklin's unique ability as a diplomat and use his skills in all these negotiations.
Yeah.
So that's my thinking. Ken Burns, in his documentary, said Franklin was by far America's greatest diplomat.
Yeah. Someone mentioned in your book on the greatest American is Adam Smith. Was Franklin familiar with Smith and his ideas?
Yeah, so I have a chapter called Ben Franklin, Adam Smith's Invisible Hand.
Right.
And so they influenced each other. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, while he was preparing it, Franklin was in London at the same time for a couple of years. And Franklin says that Adam Smith would bring in his chapters as they were writing them and would present them to these various clubs that are in London. And he was one of the readers, and he would give suggestions. And there's a huge section in the Wealth of Nations on America as a very up-and-coming colony. And Adam Smith actually declares, he says that soon America will be a great and prominent nation in the world. And I think he came out in favor of American independence in 1776 book, which was really quite controversial, because you had people like Edward Gibbon who were very much opposed to American independence. And, of course, all the government there. So Adam Smith was taking a chance there. But I believe he was heavily influenced by Benjamin Franklin, and vice versa. Adam Smith's free trade and so forth. Franklin has a lot of strong views in favor of free trade. He says no nation was ever ruined by trade, even those who are most hurt by it. Well, that's very different from Donald Trump saying we've been ripped off all these years. He would argue that globalization has been very beneficial.
Often try to remind people that of Adam Smith's influence on the framers, on the founding fathers, because Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, and a lot of them all made references to Adam Smith.
They all read The Wealth of Nations.
Yeah,
it was a best-selling book. It sold out within 6 months.
Yeah. My organization is going to be doing a number of events next year to celebrate America 250, and we want to make sure economics and Adam Smith and capitalism is the commercial republic that we were founded as is a big part of that story.
Well, the first 100 years, there's no question that the government depended largely on tariffs for their revenues. But we didn't
because our government was much smaller than today.
Well, government was small, but also the United States in its eventually 50 states was a free trade zone. And we didn't import a lot, particularly. And so they made money from that, but the country boomed despite the high tariffs that were in existence in the 19th century. So, Donald Trump has that wrong historically, that this was a golden era where we have had very high tariffs. Well, that's because the U.S. economy was much bigger than the global economy. Now, it's totally different now. 25% of our GDP is in foreign trade, and 40% of U.S.-made cars have components that come from outside the United States, foreign components.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a dangerous game that Trump is playing, and hopefully the end result will be lower trade barriers. That's what we're hopeful.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for joining me today on the Liberty and Leadership Podcast. Congratulations on your book, The Greatest American. I encourage anyone listening to go out and buy the book. It makes a great gift, especially even for young people, I think, to read the lessons that you presented there.
And I'm also arguing that it's a good coffee table book.
Yeah.
Instead of being on a bookshelf or the nightstand, put it out there and see what people say about The Greatest American and have a little debate. But the fact of the matter is, I found that Americans are very unified. They like Benjamin Franklin, whether you're Republican or Democrat, and we need that in today's world that's so divisive. So nobody can be embarrassed about putting this book out and seeing what people think.
That's for sure. Amen to that. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Be free, as Franklin would say.
Thank you for listening to the Liberty and Leadership Podcast. If you have a comment or question, please drop us an email at podcast@tfas.org. And be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app and leave a 5-star review. Liberty and Leadership is produced at Podville Media. I'm your host, Roger Ream, and until next time, show courage in things large and small.